will talk about the need for systemic solutions for climate change and nature protection, very much building on some of the things that Munta has already addressed. This, for me, is the challenge for the 21st century. We all want a good life on this planet, but we will need to do it within environmental limits. We cannot, by 2050, move another 6 to 7 billion people first into the rich and polluting, and then into the sustainable. So what we need to do is this, and it's the essence also of the Paris Agreement. No, do not first develop a polluting, resource-intensive energy system. Skip that stage and move immediately into where we need to be. And of course, the biggest push needs to come from those who are already living well, but well above the means of the planet. If you want to live within ecological limits, the boundary condition for the 21st century is that we accept that ecosystems are what they are, and we will have to organize the key systems that provide well-being and wealth in society, the energy system, the food and agricultural system, the mobility system and the urban system as the ones that we will have to organize in a very different way. If you look at the planetary boundaries discussion, I'm not going to go into any details, but if you're in the green zone, you are in what is called in this knowledge field a safe operating space, which means, yes, you will have turbulence in the system, but we think we can manage it through good governance, through technology, through behavioral change. If you go outside of that, you enter into a zone of uncertainty, which could be very risky for human society. And the two ones where we are well above the limits are, to many people's surprise, not primarily climate change, but they are biodiversity, and they are the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, which is of course very closely linked to our agricultural and food system, and thus to fundamental functions of biodiversity. So the two crucial ones are actually linked to the topic that you are discussing today. How is the EU on track to reach some of these objectives? If you look towards 2030 and 2050, the biggest risk we see is the risk of a lock-in, where you say, let's try to reach these targets in 2030, the minus 40%, by perfecting the systems that we have, which means you put your investments, your R&D, your technology, all into that. But we think you will lock in. There are tangential limits to efficiency gains in the current systems. What we need is a transitional approach where we invest in technologies that will not get us to 2030, but to 2050. So the crucial type of knowledge that we want to create is knowledge that can tell to policymakers, not just are you reaching your 2030 goals, but are you reaching them by opening pathways to 2050, or are you reaching them by closing pathways to 2050? If we want to take 2030 serious, we will have to do more than create efficiency gains in current systems. We will have to be transformational, we call it transitional, in policies, in technology, in fiscal systems, in financial systems, in legal systems, as you are discussing today. By now we know that if we don't drastically become more resource efficient, we will not reach the 80 to 95% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. There's too much carbon embedded in the material cycle. Yeah? So circular economy and low carbon economy are systemically linked to each other, at least in our understanding. But land is also increasingly regarded as a crucial resource and playing a role both in the carbon cycle and in the circular economy. So there again, there is a systemic link, and of course the water cycle is another crucial element that plays in both. And it is there that we need to create resilience. Yeah? And so law can be an instrument to improve our chances of creating a resilient society.
I was going to start also with this sad day, but we could also look at it as a day of hope, because maybe this is a day where we really wake up. And maybe this is also the day where we get into a bit of a revolutionary approach, where we really start to change the paradigm, because that's what I heard already. The paradigm is completely wrong, and it needs a fundamental change. For us, the SDGs are core to our program. And that program also mentions work on a rights for nature approach. So members have asked us to do so at the last Congress, to look into this. Hence, I'm obviously here to speak about what are the opportunities, what are maybe the challenges, and what are we looking at for what is needed. We, in Europe, with the regulation have achieved law and nature directives and other successful legislation. I think Europe has shown the success. Within Europe, we have been able to kind of hold most of that loss. But don't forget that we have lost through a very thriving bioeconomy in the Middle Ages, all the forests almost in Europe. And so there's not much natural space left in Europe. We also have to remind ourselves of that. But the quality of the environment is reasonably good. We have still big problems with fine particles and air pollution. I think is one of the main challenges. But we have made steps forward. But you know, honestly, it's marginal. It's not going to the core of what's really needed. There's still not a paradigm shift. There is one graph, and I was waiting for Hans to show it actually, because it's from a course he gave at the university, where he had a graph saying this is how it is an exponential increment of multilateral agreements. And then you look at the environmental quality, and it's still going down. So we have a bit of an essential problem here, that it's, okay, I guess that it would have been worse if we wouldn't have had these MAAs, but it's definitely not doing the job at the moment. Is it because they're not fit for purpose? One question, is it because they're not implemented enough? I guess one of the most important answers to that. But it's not working. And especially that environmental quality is going down in the developing countries. So let's keep that in mind as well. So we're kind of pushing it also a bit away. Coming back to rights for nature, if you have a debate about it, you also need to look at human rights for nature, or to nature, or for access to nature. And that, of course, is where the whole debate becomes quite complex, because you will have a right for nature, and in some places it actually has happened. They have actually allocated water rights to a wetland, for example. But then, of course, the people that are living there need an access as well. And we have examples of where you see conservation going in the wrong direction, where you have local population that can't access in their sustainable way. And of course, here again, we need a definition of sustainability, which is always tricky, but local communities and sometimes are even deprived access to their local resources. So there is a bit of a tension there that you have to be careful with when you develop this, but as a basic principle, giving more rights to nature, you can be against it. And IUCN has therefore agreed on resolutions in 2012, and in 2000, now again, in our last Congress, it was re-emphasized. And there's a clear willingness, and here I'm not a lawyer, but I will play the lawyer a bit by reading it out. So very, very specifically, that we have an adoption of this resolution that says, initiate a dialogue for designing and implementing a strategy for dissemination, communication, and advocacy concerning the rights of nature. It is quite clear that the members of IUCN voted in a majority that IUCN really needs to look into this.
I've been doing a lot of research on the failures of environmental law and why it's important to try to move towards nature rights. Over the last 40 years, environmental law in general and the EU environmental law has been developing through two main phases, which correspond to two trends which may seem as opposed trends. The regulatory trend on the one side and the deregulatory trend on the other side. If you look at the regulatory trend, you might say that the problem with that it has been characterized by an attempt to protect the environment through adoption of legislation which is mostly aimed at managing what they are called negative environmental externalities. The problem with that, there are major criticalities, that you have an emergency response approach, which is still the reference approach of most of European legislation. You have a lack of medium-long-term vision. You have very often a short-term vision. And most of all, you have a support of the mainstream economic model, which is based on the infinite growth paradigm, which is impossible on a finite planet. If you look at the regulatory trends, this has been characterized by the need, by the tendency in recent years to streamline, simplify, and reduce environmental law. But the problem with that approach is that it doesn't change and it doesn't question the externalities managing approach that I've been describing earlier. So there are still major criticalities with this trend that very often it brings the risk that you have a decrease in the level of environmental protection and you have a continued support of the mainstream economic model. So along the lines of what was said earlier, if you look at the studies of the European Environment Agency, even with this new trend, you are not on the right track. So what is the proposed way out, in my opinion? Trying to put the proposal of rights of nature on a broader perspective about the law and how the law needs to be changed. I think that the reference framework that we should have in mind into which the approval of this directive proposal should be framed can be based on three elements. The first one is the enforcement of the integration principle. The second one is the need of a change of paradigm. And the third one is the need to reassess EU environmental law. As you all know, the integration principle is one of the main principles that are written in the treaty, that it is relevant for environmental protection, and says that environmental protection requirements should be integrated into the definition and implementation of all other policies. I think in Europe, in European Union law, we have a serious problem with the use of this principle. The shift from an externalities managing approach to a nature rights ecosystem protection approach should be grounded on a change of paradigm. The problem is not how you call that. The problem is that we understand that we need a change, we need a strong transition, we need to go into a paradigm where ecosystem resilience is in the first place, and we work towards patterns of human development in harmony with nature. What you need is a reassessment and revision of the law, which means that you don't need to change all the law. You need some few new pieces. One of these, I think, is this proposal of directive of rights of nature. Giving rights of nature would change the perspective also in the way we implement a lot of the existing European legislation. And along with these, you will need a reinterpretation of the existing legislation in the furtherance of the new paradigm.
I will speak more about the how. How can we enable nature's rights? So firstly is to really think about, how do we engage complex systems? So to be effective in our efforts for change, we need to work within the context of reality. And the context of reality is that we all are part of a living system. So I believe the more that we can see our economic, our political, and our social systems as living systems, the more effective we will be in our strategies for change. First, it's about seeing the whole and the interconnection of its parts. So for me, a big question is, how do we understand our social, economic, and political systems as the whole, but also the interrelationship of their parts? Another thing about seeing the world through the lens of a complex system is about embracing emergence and unpredictability. So for example, a small intervention, like a match, can burn down a forest fire in hours. So what are the small interventions that we can make that are going to create a really big impact? So with the Finance Innovation Lab, we really looked at the whole system, we studied interrelationships in the parts, and we worked at what Donella Meadows calls the highest order leverage points. That's to tackle root issues by really shifting the mindsets and the values underpin the system, the actual changing the purpose of the system itself, and changing the rules and regulations that hold that system in place. The second approach that I feel is important, really, enabling nature's rights, is about deepening connection. So another principle of a complex living system is that everything is based on relationships. No one thing lives in isolation. We live in relationship to each other. That means that our work as leaders of change is relational. For me, as a leader of change, I'm constantly asking, what is my purpose? How can I improve my relationship with other people? And what is my relationship to nature and the wider system that I'm part of? The complexity of our challenges is so great. Our systems are so stuck that we cannot do this in isolation. We need to find new ways to work together. It's very much about convening an ecosystem that brings people together in collaborations who normally wouldn't meet.